If you are currently leveling up your Django skills with this tutorial is part of a free YouTube playlist. The link to the whole playlist is in the video description. Now, if you love this tutorial and playlist, then you might also like to check out the whole course, Django Database ORM Mastery on Udemy. The link to the course, which should provide the best price, can be found in the video description. We now have everything set for us to move into testing. Now, you may have noticed that this module of the course, I have broken down testing into different sections because we are going to perform very similar tests to which we have already created for the Django models, but we are going to extend that now and have a look at some other testing that we might perform when building or creating structural tests. So far, we have our design specification. What we did originally is that we created our Django models, and then we created a range of structural tests, which I will just name ST, and then these tests tested, or we checked to make sure that our models met the specification of our design. That was the whole point of the test. So we built tests to check to ensure that our models have been created successfully and correctly as per our design specification. So the goal now is to create similar types of tests and other types of structural tests to now test the design or our specification against the actual migration of the models within our database. So this is our database. Obviously, our models would have been migrated to the database. So now we want to create a range of structural tests to test the database now meets our design specification. Now, do also remember here, we're not only focusing on learning how to test different aspects of Django, but also taking the opportunity to explore various components of Django and PostgreSQL databases. So this approach hopefully was aiming to enhance our understanding of both testing practices and the underlying database structures, hopefully giving us a more comprehensive grasp of how these systems interact and operate. So by creating a range of structural tests now on the Django models that have been migrated to our Postgres database, we now have the ability, or we now have an opportunity to explore the PostgreSQL introspection tools. The PostgreSQL introspection tools are utilities that allow users to explore and analyze the database structure. This includes schemas, tables, indexes, and relationships, so we can gather all that information so that we can then perform tests. The tests, of course, that we build with this information that we've gathered from this introspection utility will obviously ensure that the database schema and structure, tables, indexes, relationships, all align with our application's requirements or our database or design requirements. Now, you may have already seen in the next module, we are going to start to actually insert data into the database. Well, actually building structural tests on the database, we are going to need to query the database. So we will start to learn, in fact, in this module, how to create raw SQL or use Django approaches to interact with the database so that we can start to test certain parts of our database that it meets our application or database requirements. Now, through this process, we will also learn how to automate the generation of data for tests, because some tests will require some sort of data for us to actually test a feature or function. And this isn't solely related to structural tests that we are focused on in this module, but we will then utilize this approach potentially for other tests further along the development process. Okay, so back to the testing, what it is that we're actually going to be doing now. So you may have already noticed that, as I've already said, there are a few sections now. We're going to expand our knowledge of structural testing and perform some additional tests. Now that we've added some additional features and functionality within our design, it gives us an opportunity to explore some of these different types of structural tests. So in this first part of testing, we are simply going to be performing very similar tests to what we have already created for the models, but of course now they will need to be adapted to test the actual database tables in the actual database rather than testing the Django models that we performed previously. So this is the current version of the design, our database design. We have two schemas now, you remember, inventory schema and inventory management schema. We have already implemented that in a tutorial a few steps back. Now, we are going to, of course, need to test that, but the first tests that we're going to perform are table and column validation on our tables. Now, I'm going to take you through the whole range of structural tests on just the category table, and then I'm going to leave it up to you whether you want to then follow along for the other tables. You will notice that I have created a tutorial for each and every individual test that we're going to perform on the category, but there will be one single then tutorial for each other table to perform all of the tests on those individual tables. So the idea here is that you follow along step by step with the category table, performing the tests, the new tests that we're going to build, the structural tests, and then it's really up to you whether you want to follow along and perform all the tests on the other tables. Now, if you go into structural testing, you'll notice that we did have the structural testing markdown file, which detailed the tests we created originally for the Django models. I've now created this post-migration structural testing markdown file, which now extends upon that, because remember, we have also now created, if you take a look at the design, remember we have now created custom check constraints, unique constraints, and triggers for each and every table. So I have updated the table and column validation test to reflect those changes because we didn't test them originally when we created those customizations in the previous module. So there is going to be a tutorial for each and every test. I will give you some more specific information about the test as we work through them. So let's go ahead and get started. So first of all, we're going to build a test to confirm the presence of the table within the database schema. Now remember, this is all about after we have migrated the models to the database.